First broadcast in 1959, The Twilight Zone arrived at a moment when American life was shaped by Cold War anxiety, rapid technology change, and intensifying debates about conformity and civil rights. Created and hosted by Rod Serling, the series used science fiction, fantasy, and horror not as escapes from reality, but as lenses that made reality harder to ignore. In tightly constructed half-hour morality plays, often ending with a twist that reframed everything the viewer has just seen, the show argued that the most frightening monsters are frequently human: fear, prejudice, greed, and the hunger for power. As an anthology series, The Twilight Zone reset its world each week, telling self contained stories with new characters, settings, and rules. This format encouraged experimentation. A suburban living room, that could become a psychological trap. A small town street could reveal the community's cruelty, and an ordinary conversation could tilt into the uncanny. Because each episode had a limited time, the writing relied on economy and precision, clean setups, escalating tension, and endings that delivered both surprise and meaning. Serling's distinctive narration framed each tale like a cautionary fable, guiding audiences into the Twilight Zone, while insisting that its strangeness was only a step away from everyday life. Even the title carries this idea of a boundary state, and Serling himself defined it in words that became as famous as many of the episodes. In one of the best known season 1 openings, he called the Twilight Zone a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man, describing it as the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and adding that it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. A dimension of imagination that the series simply names and explores. What's easy to miss, however, is the show did not stick to a single definition of the Twilight Zone. Across different seasons and sometimes within the same season, Serling's introductory language changed to match the new title sequence. Different pacing needs, and the series' evolving sense of what kind of journey it was inviting viewers to take. In broad strokes, the series moved along three overlapping ways of framing the title. Number one, conceptual definition, a fifth dimension. That sounds like a lecture from a calm, omnipotent guide. Number two, a direct invitation. You're about to enter another dimension. Next stop, the Twilight Zone. That treats the show like a threshold the audience is about to cross. And three, a more fully staged passage. You unlock this door with a key of imagination. You just crossed over into the Twilight Zone. That turns the title into an action the viewer performs. Each approach sets expectations differently. The fifth dimension language primes the audience to read the coming story as an idea tested under pressure, while next stop and signpost phrases prime the audience to watch for a moral turning point, the moment when the world tilts and the rules quietly change. Season 1 is the most viable. Alongside the fifth dimension definition, some early episodes used the brisker invitation. You're about to enter another dimension, a dimension not only of sight and sound, but of mind. Next stop, the Twilight Zone, which gets viewer into the plot quickly and suits the show's half-hour format. And in seasons 2 and 3, Serling favored the travel and warning motif. You're traveling through another dimension. That's the signpost up ahead. Your next stop, the Twilight Zone. A version that feels like a guided journey and pairs naturally with the era's emphasis on momentum. The audience is already moving, and the opening functions like a road sign announcing an approaching border. When the show shifted to hour-long episodes in season 4, and then returned to half hours in season 5 while keeping the updated visuals, the opening became the most concrete and theatrical. You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. The accompanying title sequence of floating everyday objects, a door, an eye, a clock, made the metaphor visible, suggesting that the Twilight Zone is accessed through a familiar thing made strange. These shifts are more than cosmetic. The fifth dimension opening positions Serling as a commentator who can step outside time and label whatever the viewer is about to see. It lends the episode an essay-like authority, as though the story is a case in study in human behavior. The next stop and signpost versions, by contrast, cast the viewer as a traveler, implying that the lesson will be discovered through movement, through plot, escalation, and the sudden realization that a boundary has been crossed. The door version goes further by giving the audience a role in the experience. You unlock. It makes imagination the mechanism of entry, which is an effective fit for longer, more atmospheric episodes that benefit from a slightly slower ramp up before the central premise clicks into place. Tone-wise, the evolution moves from abstract to the intimate, and it is inseparable from the way openings looked and sounded. In season 1, the fifth dimension language is formal and slightly scientific in cadence, measured, declarative, and delivered like a calm bulletin from above the story. That authority matches the early misty, more abstract title imagery and the comparatively somber first season music written by Bernard Herrmann, which leans into suspense and uneasy rather than the catchy hook. The combined effect is to tell the viewer before any character appears that this is a serious experiment. A moral problem will be placed under glass and observed. When seasons 2 and 3 shift to the traveling and signpost openings, the tone becomes more kinetic and conversational. Shorter phrases, forward motion, and a lightly urgent warning that something is up ahead. Visually, the show also moves towards a cleaner, more graphic design element, and most memorably, the opening is paired with the Marius Constant theme, introduced in season 2, whose sharp staccato motif functions like an alarm bell. With that sound underneath Serling's voice, the introduction feels less like a definition and more like a push through a doorway. The viewer is propelled into the story and primed to expect a sudden turn. By seasons 4 and 5, the You Unlock This Door opening adopts the most theatrical second person tone and the now iconic title montage of floating objects door, eye, clock, shattered window, and other everyday symbols. It makes the metaphor concrete. Serling's frequent on camera appearances, often standing alone in an empty stage like space, reinforce that direct address. He's not merely narrating from outside the story, but looking the audience in the eye as a host who invites them to cross the boundary with him. The narrator no longer merely describes a dimension, he conducts an initiation. The music and design work together suggest that the Twilight Zone is not just a far-off realm, but a hidden mechanism inside ordinary life, one that could be triggered at any moment, with the audience cast as participant rather than observer. Serling's hosting style is crucial to why the show's framing feels authoritative without being preachy. On camera, he presents himself as both MC and witness, dressed sharply, often holding a cigarette, speaking with a controlled calm that lets the strange events register as matter of fact. A hallmark of his delivery is the way he addresses viewers directly. You are traveling. You unlock the door, making the audience feel implicated in the most moral test that is about to unfold. His introductions frequently use understated, almost journalistic phrasing to normalize the uncanny. Submitted for your approval style announcements. And his closing tags deliver compact judgments with wry precision. In The Shelter, he refuses to soften the lesson. No moral, no message, no prophetic tract, just a simple statement of fact. For civilization to survive, the human race has to remain civilized. In The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, the epilogue widens the story into a warning about internal enemies. There are weapons that are simply thoughts, attitudes, prejudices, concluding that prejudices can kill and suspicion can destroy. In The Obsolete Man, he turns a dystopian execution into an indictment of tyranny itself, declaring that Any state, any ideology that fails to recognize the worth, the dignity, the rights of humanity, that state is obsolete. In The Mirror, Serling translates political paranoia into a general diagnosis, a sickness known as hate, highly contagious, deadly in its effect, and then aims the morale outward. Don't look for it in the Twilight Zone, look for it in the mirror. In Nick of Time, the closing locates the true danger not in a fortune telling machine, but in the mind that submits to it, describing the tyranny of fear and suspicion as one of the darker places a person can wander into. In A Stop at Willoughby, he frames escapism as both yearning and warning, asking whether Willoughby is wishful thinking or the last stop in the vast design of things. And in It's a Good Life, the final tag is chillingly minimal. No comment here, no comment at all, before he warns viewers to think only good thoughts. Because anything less than handled at your own risk, even when he turns cosmic horror into a grim joke, as in To Serve Man, the evolution of man going from dust to dessert. The punchline is still an ethical jab at human arrogance and self-deprecation. Serling's moral lines often work because they turn irony into instruction. Many episodes build to situational irony, where the character gets precisely what they wanted in the worst possible way. Henry Bemis finally has time enough at last, but it arrives after a catastrophe. The travelers in To Serve Man are welcomed by apparent benevolent visitors, only to discover the hospitality is literal consumption. Serling's closing narration then performs a final pivot. It names the irony, so the ending does not land as a mere gotcha, but as a judgment about blindness, self-deception, or complacency. At other times, he uses verbal irony, adopting a restrained, almost polite tone to describe moral collapse, wishful thinking versus the last stop, or the dry warning about the tyranny of fear and suppression. Letting understatement sharpen the sting. Across these examples, the ethical point is delivered with paradoxical mix of elegance and bite. The viewer is invited to enjoy the twist and then immediately asked to recognize why it hurts. These lines are not decorative epigrams. They are part of the show's ethical machinery. Serling's openings often identify a character's flaw or pressure point in advance, so the episode plays like a controlled experiment in which vanity, fear, loneliness, or prejudice is put under strain and made visible. The closing narration then names what happened, sometimes gently, sometimes with prosecutorial bluntness. So the twist does not end as a mere surprise, but as a judgment about choices and values. Time Enough at Last, for example, ends by placing its famous irony inside a larger human, warning, as Serling describes Bemis, as just a fragment of what man has deeded to himself, redirecting the tragedy from one unlucky individual to the broader consequences of a world willing to destroy itself. In this way, Serling's hosting style becomes a kind of ethical framing device. It turns the audience curiosity about the strange into the self-recognition, insisting that the real subject of the Twilight Zone is not the supernatural, but what people do when they believe they are frightened, justified, or alone. That hosting model became a lasting template for how television can frame short, self-contained moral stories. Later anthology and horror programs drew on Serling's mix of elegance and warning. Some adopted a similarly sober guide figure, while others inverted it into camp or comedy. But the basic function, introduce the premise, set the tone, and deliver a closing moral sting, remained recognizably Serling-like. The influence can be seen in the very expectation that an anthology might have a presenter who speaks from just outside the story world, whether it is a suave master of ceremonies, as in Alfred Hitchcock Presents, or the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, which offered a different, more sardonic persona, or a more overly theatrical figure like the Tales from the Crypt's Crypt Keeper. Even series without an on-camera host often borrow Serling's rhetorical posture, brief, emphatic framing that treats the episode as a thought experiment, an approach echoed in modern speculative television such as Black Mirror. And when the franchise itself returned in later revivals, the decision to put a recognizable public figure in Serling's position, most notably Jordan Peele in the 2019 revival, underscored how separate the show's identity is from the idea of a host who looks at the audience and says, in effect, that the story is about us. There were also practical reasons for the evolution. Title sequences were periodically refreshed, and the narration had to match the imagery and rhyme. A fast opening that snaps the audience to attention works well when an episode must establish character and premise in minutes, while a more elaborate storybook setup better complements the longer running time. A season 4 expansion to an hour encouraged more scene setting and mood, so the opening could be afforded less purely definitional and more experimental. Finally, as the series entered syndication and became a repeat viewing staple, the opening served as a branding function. The consistent promise of a threshold, a warning sign, or a door reinforced the idea that any ordinary moment could tip into the uncanny, and that the viewer would recognize the crossing by Serling's voice. Serling also offered a more personal, practical explanation for the phrase. When asked how he came up with the title, he said, "I thought I made it up," but later learned that it was an Air Force term for a disorienting moment on approach when a pilot cannot see the horizon. Placed next to the evolving openings, that remark is fitting. Whether the Twilight Zone is introduced as a fifth dimension, a next stop, a signpost, or a door, the point's the same. Orientation fails, assumptions wobble, and the viewers are left to invite to see everyday worlds from an unsettling angle. The series' most lasting achievement is how it smuggled social criticism into popular entertainment. Serling had previously battled sponsors and networks over teleplays that addressed racism, mob violence, and political corruption. In The Twilight Zone, allegory became a shield that made it difficult topics broadcastable. Episodes repeatedly returned to the costs of scapegoating and the seductions of authoritarian certainty, portraying crowds that turn on the vulnerable, institutions that dehumanize, and individuals who trade empathy for security. Even when the plots involve time travel or alien visitors, the central questions are ethical. What do people owe one another? How easily can society justify cruelty, and how quickly can normal become another word for exclusion? It's also worth noting that The Twilight Zone effectively had a pilot that audiences did not see as a regular series episode. Before CBS committed to Serling's Anthology, his time travel teleplay, The Time Element, aired in 1958 on Westinghouse's Desilu Playhouse, introduced by Desi Arnaz. The story, about a man who repeatedly finds himself on the eve of Pearl Harbor and fails to convince anyone to change history, already contained many ingredients that would become the series' signature. Speculative premises grounded in everyday settings, a mounting sense of dread, and a final twist that blurs the line between reality and illusion. Strong viewer reaction to that broadcast helped convince CBS that Serling's brand of thoughtful fantasy could draw an audience, clearing the path for the later filmed pilot, Where Is Everybody?, which was used to sell the series and then broadcast with some revisions to narration and framing as the show's first original episode. After that success, Serling reportedly drafted a separate half-hour script meant to serve as the series' formal launch, The Happy Place. In this rejected, never-filmed pilot proposal, a future society treats citizens as disposable once they reach a prescribed age, often described as 60. Shipping them off to a named facility the happy place, where they are eliminated for the purposes of good for the community. Accounts of the script emphasize how directly it confronted the moral horror of bureaucratized cruelty, and CBS executives reportedly considered it too bleak to introduce the program to viewers, just as crucially to advertisers. In spirit, its premise anticipates later Twilight Zone episodes that criticize dehumanizing systems and enforced normalcy, including stories that exposed conformity, institutional violence, or the quiet ways a society learns to call injustice necessary. The fact that this first choice was turned away is revealing. It shows that Serling's social conscience was present from the start, and it helps explain why the Twilight Zone so often relied on metaphor, irony, and suspenseful misdirection to deliver tough ideas in a form television would actually broadcast. Culturally, the Twilight Zone helped define the grammar of modern speculative storytelling, proving that genre television could be literary, political, and emotionally resounding without losing its mainstream appeal. Its signature method was the what if premise. An everyday situation is nudged by one impossible variable, and the story follows the human consequences with the logic of a parable. That structure, simple setup, moral pressure cooker, and a final turn that reveals what the episode has really been about, became a template for later anthology series and for countless high concept episodes across science fiction, horror, and even comedy. The series' cultural impact is also measurable in its specific stories that continue to be referenced, remade, and debated. Episodes such as Time Enough at Last, with its cruelly ironic final image, The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street, a study of paranoia and scapegoating, and Eye of the Beholder, a critique of enforced sameness, have been taught and quoted as shorthand for larger ideas. The fear of one another, the fragility of fairness, and the pressure to conform. The show's twist endings entered the cultural toolkit not simply as tricks, but as a way to expose hidden assumptions about power and identity. Even the phrase the Twilight Zone became an everyday idiom for moments that feel surreal, illogical, or morally upside down, showing how series moved from television into common speech. Just as important is the way the Twilight Zone shaped how television could look and sound. Working within tight budgets, the production relied on bold lighting, minimalistic sets, and precise staging to make the ordinary feel unstable. Those constraints pushed the show towards an expressive style that later genre creators would imitate. The program also proved that networks would air challenging material if it arrived wrapped in suspense and imagination, encouraging writers to use metaphor when direct political speech was discouraged by sponsors or by standards departments. Its long aftermath and syndication introduced new generations to Serling's voice and the anthology format, keeping the series in circulation as a shared reference point for audiences and creators alike. From prestige concept episodes to modern anthologies that examine technology, social fear, or institutional control, the show's central lesson endures. Speculative stories can be entertaining while still functioning as arguments about the world. More than 6 decades after its debut, The Twilight Zone remains compelling because its imagination is disciplined by moral purposes. The episodes do not merely ask viewers to marvel at paradoxes, they ask viewers to recognize themselves in them, especially the small choices that under pressure become ethical failures. By pairing inventive premises with clear stakes, Serling and his collaborators produce stories that still speak to contemporary fears about technology, division, and the frailty of democratic norms without losing their entertainment value. In that sense, the show's title is less a destination than a warning. The Twilight Zone is where people arrive when they stop questioning what they believe and start accepting injustice as ordinary. Here are a few pieces of trivia about the show. Rod Serling was never initially planned to do the introductions. He actually wanted Richard Egan to do the narration because of his deep, rich voice. However, due to strict studio contracts of the time, Egan was unable. Serling said, "It's Richard Egan or no one. It's Richard Egan or I'll do it myself," which is exactly what happened. Orson Welles was also up for narration, but he was way too expensive for the show. Rod Serling admitted that several of the episodes, including some of his own, could have been better, saying, "I guess a third of the shows are pretty damn good, and a third are passable, and another third are dogs." Rod Serling made up the phrase "the sixth dimension" to use in season one's opening narration. William Self of CBS asked him, well, what was the fifth dimension, given that dimensions 1 through 3 are exemplified by line, a plane, and cube, respectively, and the fourth was thought to be time. Serling answered, "I don't know, aren't there five?" He changed the narration to, "There's a fifth dimension." The Dummy from 1962 is routinely voted as the scariest series episode by critics. Rod Serling either wrote or co-wrote 92 episodes himself of the total 156 episodes of the original series. Due to budgetary constraints in its second season, the network decided to cut costs by shooting some episodes on videotape rather than film. Because videotape was a relatively primitive medium in the early 1960s, the editing of tape was next to impossible. Thus, each of the 6 episodes was camera cut, as in live television, on a studio soundstage using a total of 4 cameras. The requisite multi-camera setup of the videotape experiment pretty much precluded location shooting, severely limiting the potential scope of the storylines, and so the short-lived experiment was ultimately abandoned. The limitations of using videotape, it could not be edited as cleanly as film, and its visual quality was so much poorer, led the network to switch back to film for the rest of the series. Despite the greater cost, the 6 videotaped episodes were titled The Lateness of the Hour, 1960, Static, The Whole Truth, The Night of the Meek, 22, and Long Distance Call, and then transferred to film for broadcast, which saved the producers about $5,000 an episode. Although the phrase "submitted for your approval" from Rod Serling's opening narration has come to be closely identified with the show and is often used by Serling impressionists, it was only heard in 3 episodes: Cavender is Coming, In Praise of Pip, and A Kind of Stopwatch. Other than Rod Serling, Robert McCord was the only actor to appear in all 5 seasons. In second place are Jack Klugman, John Anderson, John Lormer, and Vaughn Taylor, who each appeared in 4 seasons. Klugman and Taylor appeared in the first, third, fourth, and fifth season. Anderson appeared in the first, second, fourth, and fifth season, and Lormer appeared in each of the first 4 seasons. Several of the actors in the show would make more than one appearance. Among them were Jack Klugman, William Shatner, Burgess Meredith, Fritz Weaver, Warren Oates, Jack Warden, William Wyndham, and Martin Landau. Ed Wynn and Keenan Wynn were the only father and son actors to appear in The Twilight Zone. Ed appeared in One for the Angels, and Keenan appeared in A World of His Own. Although The Twilight Zone played for 5 seasons with 156 episodes, only one episode, Caesar and Me, was written by a woman, Adele T. Strassfield, and only one episode, The Masks, was directed by a woman, Ida Lupino.